Welcome. This lecture is on President Ronald Reagan's Cold War victory. At his first presidential press conference in 1981, Ronald Reagan declared, "So far, détente's been a one-way street the Soviet Union has used to pursue its own aims. Soviet leaders reserve unto themselves the right to commit any crime, to lie, to cheat." End quote. For Reagan, the perceived policy of accommodation and cooperation, which Richard Nixon and Henry Kissinger engineered and Gerald Ford and Jimmy Carter followed, was a failure. Convinced that socialism would lose any head-to-head competition with capitalism, Reagan chose to take a more aggressive approach to worldwide communism, and one essential component of this strategy was to strengthen the American military and economy. As he told one reporter in October 1981, the Soviets, quote, "cannot vastly increase their military productivity because they've already got their people on a starvation diet. America needed to demonstrate its will and determination to go forward with a military buildup and convince the Soviets that they can't keep up." Reagan's strategy for peace was simple. He believed he could speed up the inevitable self-destruction of socialist economies and thus win the Cold War. In Richard Nixon's first term as president, he sought a way to reduce tensions between the United States and the Soviet Union and ultimately end America's involvement in Southeast Asia. The chief architect of détente was Henry Kissinger, the academic turned national security affairs advisor, who argued that a focus on ideology hindered any chance of a realistic peace. A better idea was for the United States to modify its policymaking approach and be more accommodating to the Soviet Union wherever possible. The notion of détente went hand in hand with the concept of convergence held by some intellectuals that the Soviet Union and the United States had mellowed in a manner that was no transcendent moral difference between them. This was heresy for Americans who saw détente as morally bankrupt and bad politics. Had not détente allowed the Soviets to consolidate their position in the world, they asked? Reagan had been a staunch anti-communist since the late 1940s, learning how evil the communist system was throughout the world. The Black Book of Communism, the combined work of several scholars, argues that communist regimes were, quote, "criminal enterprises in their very essence, carrying out the planned killing of at least 85 million people in the 20th century. While the literature and media accounts of the menace of communism were common, the response of the government was inadequate, according to some Americans. "We cannot afford to be number two in defense, but sadly enough, that's where we are today, number two and fading," declared one conservative organization. Many Americans were aware of the revolutionary socialist activities in Eastern Europe, Asia, and Latin America. Memorable were events such as the Berlin Airlift, the Hungarian Revolution, the construction of the Berlin Wall, the rise of socialism in Cuba and other Latin American nations, and wars in Korea and Southeast Asia. If a significant number of Americans in the 1970s paid less attention to socialist gains by patrons of the Soviet Union, socialist expansion remained real for many others. President Jimmy Carter carried out major cuts to defense spending But events in Africa and Afghanistan clarified to some that the American response to socialist aggression was too passive. 3 examples of what unfolded in Africa after revolutionary socialism took root in the 1970s demonstrated the commitment and consequences of socialist forces. Explaining the Soviet and Cuban interests in Angola, Fidel Castro declared, quote, "Africa is today a weak link in the imperialist chain. It is there that the best hopes exist of passing from tribalism to socialism without passing through the different stages that other parts of the world have been obliged to experience," end of quote. Months after Angola gained full independence from Portugal in November 1975, Cuban and Soviet advisors supported one group of Angolan leaders. Bloody incidents between compelling leftist rivals for power became the norm, whereas the Angola economy prospered in the 1960s. It crumbled in 1975, and economic instability continued into the 1980s. One 1986 report stated that there were 35,000 Cuban troops in Angola protecting the ruling Marxist-Leninist party. Revolutionary socialist forces took control of Ethiopia in the mid-1970s, and changes there included the abolition of land ownership and the nationalization of banks, insurance companies, and most manufacturing. Mass terror was common, and in a period of 1.5 years, there were 10,000 political assassinations in the capital city of Addis Ababa. The provincial military government of socialist Ethiopia became a full-fledged Soviet satellite, and assisting the government were thousands of Soviet and East German security agents and Cuban troops. These troops made the difference in late 1977 in Ethiopia's war with neighboring Somalia. The response of the Carter administration was that American opposition to Soviet or Cuban involvement in Africa would be futile. The Marxist-Leninist government's enforced collectivization ruined the Ethiopian economy. When famine struck in the 1970s and 1980s, the socialist leaders used hunger as a weapon to meet their objectives. Most of the food generated by the Band-Aid and Live Aid campaigns, supported by a variety of high-profile music superstars from the United Kingdom and North America, went to the Ethiopian military. In October 1985, one government official stated that Ethiopia, quote, is a Marxist police state run by a small clique of ideologues. Soviet arms and influences are pervasive. Civil war rages in the north. The economy teeters on bankruptcy. Human rights abuses abound, end of quote. And if this wasn't enough, drought and famine had ravaged the land and the people. Ethiopia, quote, is a calamity of enormous dimensions. In Mozambique, the dominant political party was Frelimo, described in 1969 by one leader as follows: "I conclude today that Frelimo is more socialist, revolutionary, and progressive than ever, that our line is now firmly oriented towards Marxist-Leninist socialism," end of quote. After gaining its independence from Portugal in 1974, Mozambique witnessed increasing villagization in which the socialist government expected peasants to abandon their traditional homes and work on collective farms. Tragically, 600,000 died of hunger in the 1975 to 1985 period. Collectivization proved to be an economic disaster. Afghanistan was a different story than Africa. Revolutionary socialist inroads in Afghanistan during the 1970s remained under the radar of most Americans. That is until 1979. Beyond the 1950s, the USSR influence increased with Soviet officials holding key positions in the Afghan army and civil service. The Afghan communists formed the Democratic Party of the People of Afghanistan. Provoked by the assassination of a founding member of this party, the communists carried out a successful coup d'etat with tanks and planes in 1978. The Marxist regime began an anti-religious crusade which caused widespread discontent. The Soviets assisted the Afghan government with its crackdown of a growing rebellion movement. Within 1 year, the Afghan communists killed as many as 40,000. At one prison located on the eastern outskirts of Kabul, the director boasted, quote, "We'll leave only 1 million Afghans alive. That's all we need to build socialism," end of quote. During the 1979 Christmas holidays, the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan to squash the unrest, and within a few short months, over 100,000 Soviet troops occupied the country. Whether it was in Africa, Asia, Latin America, Eastern Europe, or another pocket of the world, socialism and perceived Soviet control showed no signs of diminishing. A determined Reagan wanted change. One key figure in the Reagan administration who knew the consequences of evil on the world stage was Richard Pipes. Scholars identify Pipes, a Harvard history professor and Sovietologist, as a key figure who sought to dismantle detente, which many clearly viewed as a reactive and defensive strategy that conceded the initiative to socialists. A Jew born in Poland, Pipes served in the US Army during World War II, taught Russian history, and established himself as an uncompromising foe of socialism. Profoundly influenced by the Holocaust and driven to expose the evil of revolutionary socialist regimes, he wrote in his memoirs, "I have been spared not to waste my life on self-indulgence or self-aggrandizement, but to spread a moral message by showing, using examples from history, how evil ideas lead to evil consequences." Pipes led an external audit to the CIA in the 1970s and found that it underestimated the threat of socialism. His appointment as the head of the Soviet desk in Reagan's National Security Council symbolized the thinking of the new government on how best to deal with the Soviet Union. A first-rate intellect and a meticulous scholar, Pipes came to the same conclusion as Reagan. America needed to quicken evolutionary change within the Soviet Union. Reagan believed that the economic strength of socialist regimes was precarious. In an address to Notre Dame University in May 1981, he declared, quote, "The years ahead are great ones for this country, the United States, for the cause of freedom and the spread of civilization. It will transcend communism. The West won't contain communism. It will dismiss it as some bizarre chapter in human history whose last pages are even now being written. Elsewhere, he wrote that the Soviet economy was a basket case kept together with baling wire. Countries behind the Iron Curtain were also a mess, and thus it was clear to him that it was only a matter of time when communism would collapse of its own weight. The destination of Soviet communism was, quote, the ash heap of history, he told the British Parliament in 1982. The economic dimension of its Cold War strategy centered on the National Security Decision Directive 75, a statement on hindering the transfer of military technology to the Soviets, avoiding any helpful subsidies to the Soviet economy, and reducing the economic leverage the Soviets had on Western nations. In 1982, Democratic historian Arthur Schlesinger was one who dismissed the idea of the Soviet Union being on the verge of economic and social collapse. On his recent trip to Moscow, Schlesinger claimed to have found more goods in the shops, quote, more food in the markets, more cars on the street, more of almost everything except for some reason, caviar, end of quote. As late as 1984, self-proclaimed socialist John Kenneth Galbraith declared the Russian system succeeds because, in contrast to the Western industrial economies, it makes full use of its manpower. There were fewer Democrats seeing socialism as a major problem. A bestseller and the most influential economics textbook in the United States since World War II was Paul Samuelson's Economics, which included a graph plotting the economic growth of both the United States and the Soviet Union. So this graph is looking at gross national product. The American output was above the Soviets, but its predicted growth was slower than the Soviets. In each successive edition over the years, the graph forecast that the Soviets would overtake American economic growth approximately 20 years in the future. So this textbook, as with some generally popular textbooks, every few years there's a revised edition, an updated edition. But the graph basically stayed the same, the idea that there was going to be a forecast 20 years in the future where the Soviet Union would have a better economic outcome than the United States. Well, by the 11th edition of Economics, and that was in 1980, the graph still showed quicker Soviet growth compared to the United States. However, because the Soviets truthfully were no closer to overtaking the Americans, Samuelson advanced the date of intersection. It wasn't until 1985 edition of Economics did he finally eliminate the bogus graph. As the world's first socialist society, the Soviet Union experienced considerable economic stagnation because of economic inefficiency. Revealing as a saying among Soviet workers in the 1970s, quote, as long as the bosses pretend they are paying us a decent wage, we will pretend we are working. There were ample statistics available to prove the inefficiency of the Soviet system. In the 1970s, approximately 24 million people of the Soviet Union's population of 250 million produce the nation's food. This is compared to United States, whereas only 4.3 million of America's 220 million were in food production. Another difference was that the Soviet Union did not produce enough food for its own people, while the United States produced a surplus for export equal to 25% of total Soviet production. A comparison within the Soviet Union itself is also instructive. Soviet agriculture workers on government collectives had permission to have private plots in which there were no taxes. Using less than 1% of total Soviet agricultural land, these workers produce 27% of the total value of Soviet agriculture production. In the Soviet Union, citizens also spent billions of hours waiting in line for food. The main culprits behind the poor productivity were a 90% tax rate and the absence of a price system to allocate scarce resources efficiently. In the 1970s, American defense spending fell by over 20%, and this is adjusted for inflation. Reagan's new approach saw the Pentagon's yearly budget almost double from $158 billion in 1981 to $304 billion in 1989. Throwing large sums of money towards missiles and the development of the Strategic Defense Initiative, coined Star Wars, the Reagan administration forced the Soviet Union to an arms race that exposed the true capacity of a socialist economic system. Considering SDI, Strategic Defense Initiative, and the idea of lasers in space destroying incoming enemy intercontinental missiles, many Soviet scientists concluded that creating a fully impenetrable missile defense was impossible. However, one leading military scientist, General Vladimir Slipchenko, recalled that Reagan's push for the SDI left the military, quote, in a state of fear and shock, because we understood that this could be realistic due to the economic and financial capabilities of the United States, end of quote. Soviet politicians reacted almost in a state of hysteria, believing they could not afford the risk of the United States having any success with Strategic Defense Initiative. Soviet defense spending in 1983 was approximately 55% higher than 3 years earlier. Under the leadership of Mikhail Gorbachev, defense expenditures rose another 45% after 1985. The Reagan administration also put considerable economic pressure on the Soviet Union by putting more military resources in third world countries than the previous Jimmy Carter administration. Several years before he became president, Reagan embraced the idea of the United States copying the Soviet strategy of guerrilla armies. Providing financial and military support for insurgents could be a powerful tool to roll back Soviet expansionism. A key figure in the covert operations of the 1980s was CIA Director William Casey, who 40 years earlier used covert action against Hitler and his National Socialist regime. The Reagan Doctrine upheld the idea of human freedom under God for all peoples, and thus support for freedom fighters from Afghanistan to Nicaragua. Latin American countries received extensive press attention during the Reagan years. In Nicaragua, the Sandinistas was a socialist group which received support from Moscow, Cuba, and North Korea. According to KGB files, Sandinista founder Carlos Fonseca was a trusted agent. In the late 1970s, the Sandinistas increased their guerrilla activities against the Nicaraguan government, finally defeating the unpopular government in July 1979. This victory brought jubilation in Moscow as the Soviets planned to use Nicaragua as a base for further socialist expansion. With Daniel Ortega as its president, the Sandinistas set up a one-party government, enacted rapid nationalization and a centrally planned economy, accepted additional Soviet military aid and several thousand Cuban advisors, and restricted freedom of the press, notably by closing down the main opposition paper, La Prensa. Beneficial to the government were the secret documents received from the East German secret police on how to deal with domestic enemies of the revolution. In the 1980s, the Sandinista army also grew from 6,000 to 75,000 troops. Especially controversial was the army's attacks and forced displacement of the Mosquito native Indians of Nicaragua. Opposition to the Sandinistas came in the form of the Nicaraguan Contras, a group led largely by officials of the previous government. It grew to a force of over 10,000 soldiers operating out of Honduras. The United States assisted the Contras through the CIA, but when Congress banned military aid to the Contras in 1984 with the Bolin Amendment, the Reagan government found other means to continue its aid to anti-socialist groups. Unknown to Reagan, Lieutenant Colonel Oliver North conducted an elaborate scheme where profits from secret arms sales to Iran went to the Contras, an act that later caused major problems for Reagan. Reagan looked better in the public eye when he sent American troops to the small Caribbean nation of Grenada. In 1979, the government of Grenada fell in a coup led by Maurice Bishop, a committed Marxist. Bishop welcomed Cuban advisors and signed a treaty with the Soviet Union, allowing them to land their reconnaissance planes at an airport to be built. There was elation in socialist circles. In 1980, Fidel Castro told East German Erich Honecker, quote, "For 30 years, we have been isolated on our own, and now there are already three of us in the region, Grenada, Nicaragua, and Cuba." Honecker added, quote, "Add to this the events in El Salvador. The USA imperialists have a strong interest that all is quiet in their backyard, but there is a new revolutionary wave in Latin America," end of quote. Even without specific information, Reagan was aware of socialist goals in the region. In early 1981, he did receive credible intelligence indicating that Grenada served as a transit point for Soviet arms bound for Marxist guerrillas in El Salvador. In October 1983, more radical members of the Grenada government declared martial law and executed Maurice Bishop. Prohibited from leaving the island were about 500 American students attending medical school. Less than 2 weeks after the coup began, Reagan sent American troops to take control of the island. Meeting its objective with approximately 6,000 troops, the largest American military operation since the Vietnam War, this was a success. Losing 19 soldiers, the Americans defeated Grenada forces, including almost 800 Cuban soldiers. The Americans found a cache of 10,000 assault rifles, 4,500 submachine guns, 15,000 hand grenades, 294 portable rocket launchers, and 16,000 rockets and 7,000 landmines. Reagan would need all the foreign policy support he could get in late 1986 and early 1987, when the Iran-Contra crisis and corresponding press frenzy brought the administration to a virtual standstill. In 1985, National Security Advisor Robert McFarlane's talk with so-called Iranian moderates resulted in a sale of American-manufactured anti-aircraft missiles to Iran without the knowledge of Congress. More serious were Lieutenant Colonel Oliver's maverick actions of seeing the Iran operation as an opportunity to free American hostages held in Lebanon and divert funds to the Contras in Nicaragua. The cover-up role of both North and National Security Advisor Joint Poindexter hurt Reagan badly. Reagan's leadership style of delegating extraordinary amounts of authority to his staff clearly backfired. Only when he admitted mistakes were made, which he did in a March 4, 1987 speech to the nation, did he begin to put the crisis behind him. In the end, various investigations and hearings failed to find evidence that Reagan was aware of key actions by North, but the Iran-Contra episode was a foreign policy blunder. Reagan's policy to weaken or extinguish revolutionary socialist regimes still had momentum. It was a costly venture, and the legacy of large deficits was a thorn Reagan supporters could not escape, but the Soviets paid a far more severe price. With Reagan committed to use economic means to defeat socialism, the communist leaders realized their choices were grim: either slashing the Soviet defense budget or enact a massive economic reform would jeopardize the Communist Party's grip on power. The reformer who rose from the pack to buy the Soviet Union some time was Mikhail Gorbachev. On the issue of arms limitation negotiation, Reagan and Gorbachev held meetings in Geneva, Switzerland in 1985 and in Iceland in late 1986. Unable to derail SDI when he met Reagan in Geneva, Gorbachev authorized increased, painful defense spending. In 1987, both leaders signed the Intermediate Range Nuclear Force Treaty, the first American-Soviet agreement to reduce arms. The following year, Reagan met again with Gorbachev in Moscow. The economy of the Soviet Union was in terrible shape, and Gorbachev needed a miracle, or at least a joint statement for peaceful coexistence, which would allow the Soviet Union to divert money from the arms race to the domestic economy. Kremlin leaders visibly blanched when Reagan greeted Gorbachev with, quote, "Thank you and God bless you." Explaining the effects of Reagan's words, one Russian diplomat wrote, "The heretofore impregnable edifice of communist atheism was being assaulted before their very eyes by a man who had made his name as a hard-line anti-communist." Days later, Reagan spoke of freedom to Soviet university students. Freedom is the right to question and change the established way of doing things. It is the continuing revolution of the marketplace. It is the understanding that allows us to recognize shortcomings and seek solutions. It is the right to put forth an idea scoffed at by the experts and watch it catch fire among the people. It is the right to stick, to dream, to follow your dream, or stick to your conscience, even if you're the only one in a sea of doubters. Freedom is the recognition that no single person, no single authority of government has a monopoly on the truth, but that every individual life is infinitely precious, that every one of us put on this world has been put there for a reason and has something to offer. End quote. Reagan did not give Gorbachev what he wanted, but he got what he wanted. More people could see the flaws of socialist thinking. A few days after Reagan left the White House in January 1989, Marxist writer Robert Heilbroner admitted in the New Yorker that capitalism won the contest over socialism. Quote, "The Soviet Union, China, and Eastern Europe have given us the clearest possible proof that capitalism organizes the material affairs of humankind more satisfactorily than socialism." End quote. In September 1989, the people of Poland voted out the communists, and 2 months later, the Berlin Wall fell. Other communist nations in Eastern Europe fell out of the Soviet orbit, and socialist regimes elsewhere struggled without aid from Moscow. With no Soviet assistance, the Sandinista government lasted only until 1990. The Sandinistas experiencing a stunning defeat in the 1990 election. In the following year, the Soviet Union was no more, and many Americans credit Reagan for bringing down the socialist regime. The impact of this development was enormous. In the 1990s, Americans witnessed huge defense savings and budget surpluses. And market capitalism quietly displaced socialist central planning policies worldwide. There were Americans who were never enthusiastic about detente, and they clearly rejected any notion of moral equivalence. They believed it was a pipe dream to expect the United States and heads of socialist states getting together and solving problems at the conference table. The best chance for peace was by military strength. Only after a show of strength and forceful action could talks have any success. There were good reasons why Soviets often referred to Reagan in derogatory fashion as the, quote, crusader. From the very beginning, Many Americans supported Reagan's policies and the reversing of socialist gains. The budget deficits were disappointing, but what mattered for Americans was the success of Reagan's Cold War policies. Reagan's critics downplayed his role in critically wounding the USSR and ending the Cold War, but many Americans witnessed enough to praise his assault on socialism. Thank you.